on the poems, and it made me think like how many different interpretations poetry offer. And this is one of the main things Sarah and I really try to keep in the translations, because if there are among you readers of both English and Turkish, maybe you may have seen, oh, but this, why did they translate it like this? This is totally possible. This is like, we had to make choices, and the choices we made together. And one of the most important things for us was to leave space for interpretation. Like that you as a reader can also capture many different things. Because there's a danger, especially when you come from a geography like Turkey, to over-interpret certain things and try to put certain messages, you know, into a poem. And even if they are there subtle, as a translator sometimes you may make the mistakes of giving too much space to certain things. And I tried, at least in the literal versions I gave you, Sarah, not to do that. And I think this is one of the main, this was one of the most important things I was careful for. And we have like many examples that we
I think it's really interesting, your approach, Janet, actually, and I can see how that principle of leaving all the options as open as possible, which I guess we were trying to do in English as well. So in your notes you would say, oh, there's this resonance and this, and then we would try to find an equivalent in English that maybe didn't quite map onto exactly those points, but had a similar openness. And I think it's really interesting that your technique involves not consulting the author, which it was really interesting actually this week to become acquainted for the first time with the way that Karin introduces these poems when she reads them. So the little details about this is something to do with childhood and its wounds, so that we went into these poems without that information, because that would almost be skewing, it would possibly close down possibilities, when your way of working is all about thinking what is the range, what is the variety of positions here. And actually I think the most interesting thing I learned about these poems in the process of translating them was how open the emotion is in them. I think maybe you could hear this in the difference between the way that Karin and I were reading, that I've learned over the course of the week that I sort of don't want to do an impression of Karin, but the poems on the page have this chattiness, have this lightness, which isn't a note that I find very easy to bring to my reading style, but I think on the page that comes through, that there's this disjunction in many of them between the very painful subject matter and really gut-punching emotion and the chattiness of the speech. So yeah, that was something tonal that we had to try and bring out as well.
But it also shows that when you read, as a reader, when you read a poem, you make that poem yours, and you're going to put your own emotions, your own background, your own life experience into how you interpret a poem. You do it when you read, I do it when I translate. So in some way, these poems become ours as well, and that's the magic, I think, with translation. And that's why it will never be exactly the same. Never. I mean, as a translator, I will accept that it will never be 100% the same, because I work in a different language. The language is different. What that language offers is different. So once you accept that, you are more free to do good work.
You know, when it comes to literary language, upon which actually poetry is always founded, regardless how political, how heavy your content is. Otherwise, you would be content with a column, which I also read. But for the sake of poetry, language is inevitable, just to create it. And while you create it, you actually break so many rules in your mother tongue. and become anarchists. And then, when it comes to translators, they themselves now feel somehow the urge to create this kind of language in the target one, in this specific one. This time breaking other kind of laws. Maybe it's not at the same spot though. Concessions would be made, inevitably. But the thing is that when you understand the world of the poet somehow, any poet, and how it sounds, it's time for the best part of the translator. I'm myself also a translator and I really like it, always. So it's the time of the initiative. You are the free creator, not the worker bound to the content anymore. Okay, content is always there. Content is your basis, the soil. But how you grow your own tree, like as you, the readers would do. I hope so that the poems are also open for as many interpretations as you individuals here sit, and if you like, can continue and combine your own history within it, so that it has some trace in your own life. Otherwise, it would only be mine. And this open space translates itself during translation as a complete trust to the translator. And you see them, they are even more concerned with my poetry in the end than I am, because yeah, I really think so, because after so many work, I really want them to give a little bit examples, specific examples too, because as Canan has said, I really had nothing to do with the work. So it's all a surprise when they share their experience. During this time, I sat comfortably in my chair, and now that I have this result, but all this tremendous work, and with laughter and I don't know, sweat combined, so I really would like to have some of the details for me.
Well, in terms of process, like I explained, I translated them as literally as possible, but there's no such thing as just a literal translation. At some point you do interpret them. So, and lots of notes, trying to explain the context, because of course we here talking, it's poetry and it's Karin's work, but we cannot understand this poetry without understand a little bit the context, the political and the cultural context of Turkey. That helps a lot. So these things also were in my notes, and I tried also to, Google is your friend always. Google image search, and then I will send her links, and so these things I tried to be as precise as I could. And we then had a 4-hour Skype conversation. Then we looked at the poems like in every single detail, and you asked like very pertinent questions.
I asked moron questions.
Yeah, you asked brilliant questions. Sometimes it was like, oh yeah, actually no, this is wrong. I should have translated it differently, and then we have a discussion about it.
I thought actually the most interesting instances there were cases where Canan had picked, sort of in some sense, exactly the right word in English, but that sometimes that choice wouldn't strike me as an English speaker in the way that it should. There were quite a lot of examples of this. I guess not exactly false friends, but sort of that type. Like at the end of Deserted, the poem we read today that has that incredible ending about how crowded you are on the outside and how deserted within. And that line, which I think I eventually translated as a dark and vaulted well, originally came out in the literal translation as a cistern. So I said to Canan, is that talking about a toilet? Because that was the place that my mind went initially. But of course that's not what it was about at all. It was about a beautiful underground architectural network of water tunnels underneath the city in Turkey. And so I was like, I guess a cistern is technically a vessel, a large container for water in English, but yeah, we need to find something else that's going to evoke this subterranean, dripping world for an English reader. And I guess a less extreme example was we found that the titles of poems needed to change quite a lot, which is interesting that somehow, to sum up the experience of the poem for an English reader, this example was Janen's brilliant stroke of inspiration, that we talked about this for sort of 15-20 minutes, and we're really having quite a lot of trouble with how to translate the title of the poem called Civil in Turkish.
Yeah.
And I guess the most literal translation into English of that would be civil, as in C-I-V-I-L, the poem that we eventually called Uniform, which is sort of the opposite if you think about it. Because the word civil in English, whilst I guess technically it does mean like the opposite of military, or, I was like, is this a poem about politeness? Or, but in other ways in that poem there were, apart from the sort of cultural differences in the experience, there were also these incredible moments of, wow, that's exactly the same. So that the opening of that poem, which describes the gesture of rolling up your school uniform skirt, was like exactly what we did in Hertfordshire in my secondary school, and it was sort of lovely to realise that they did that in Turkey too.
Yeah, but these things are so important, right? To create all these spaces where you have, you know, we become equals. That's why translation is so important, I think, especially when you translate from countries where it is politically difficult. It's important to create this space where we are all equal. So we're equals in English, we're equals in Turkish, and there we can have a real conversation. That's always my, and I think through your poetry is possible. We have so many spaces to be able to do this, because it is more than, like you said, you could write in your columns if you want, but this is much more.
So this is actually also the magic, the freedom offered by poetry. Literature in general, but poetry specifically, where with this economy of words and the limitations of the structure, somehow you create a new world, a universe that you long for, yearn for, or otherwise record the one that you are, that you hate, you detest, both ways. And it's in its nature so oppositional that it somehow evokes everything so real in the reader's hearts that are maybe until that time a little bit buried. So this is a digging work, actually poetry does. How about you? You as a poet, in disguise of a translator.
I think Karin and Janen are very sweetly trying to steer me round to reading one of my own poems, which I've been judicious of not doing this week.
But she has to. My God, otherwise she will hate me, since it's a week that she reads my poetry, and it has been months she has nothing to do about my poetry, and I don't know a single line of her. And then talk about the poetry as if it's something so new for her. And I really want something to hear from her too. My God, with your permission.
So I was trying to think about poems of mine that resonate, that meant that certain poems of Karin seemed very, very familiar to me when I came to translate them. And I think there's a vein in my work which is sort of political in some of the ways that Karin's work is too. So poems of mine that deal with, for example, the Tiananmen massacre in China and Chinese society, and the sort of cultural amnesia and unwillingness to confront past violence. So I won't read a whole poem, but I'll read you a snippet of a poem of mine that is about the time when I was 5 years old and living in Hong Kong, and my parents took me to a political solidarity march when the student protesters were in the square in Tiananmen, but it wasn't yet apparent at that time what was going to happen in the coming days. It was still a time of great hope, the idea that China might change and become more free, and that Hong Kong would sort of triumphantly go with it in that direction. And so, by a quirk of colonial history, this solidarity march was in the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Here I'll read the last part of the poem, which is describing my child's memory of sitting on my dad's shoulders at this protest, and then going home at night to see my own image, or I imagined I'd be able to see myself in the crowd of thousands of people on the TV screen, and then eventually seeing over the next few days the images on the news change. And I compare this to the way that the turf workers would re-perfect the racecourse after the horses had gone by. On the big screen, the dots of light weren't tickering the customary shifting dance of odds, but the exact words that would rise from the rippling mouths and the stands of atoll as the crest of skyscrapers stood watch. On the news that evening, I tried to pick out my waving self among the banner's swell, the toy box people chanting in a buzz. A few days later, there were different pictures on the news. A man with 2 white shopping bags, edging crabwise on a faceless boulevard in another city where 23 years later I had struggled for over half an hour to hail a cab. On rainy race days, the turf workers, still bamboo-brimmed, would wear transparent macks dotted with drizzle and the determination of a search party. Where they pressed the clumps back down, you would never know. And so I think you can see there why Karin's poems and the way that they don't say certain things, and yet they are absolutely present in those poems, and there is a sort of ferocious anger that goes along with that not saying, was really, really resonated with me. And actually, I think the poem that we read last, Juniper Prayer Beads, I felt myself getting quite emotional reading that poem today, and that last line, murder at the hand of the state, prayer beads can't contain, just the power of that after all these other poems which are about denial and oppression and hypocrisy and lies, just the courage to sort of say it outright, it is amazingly powerful, I think. But you probably want to ask Karin some questions now, I think.
To you.
It's not clear to me from when you were reading in Turkish, but does anybody poetry rhyme? Or was that anything the translators that you tell me? Obviously the English rhyme.
Oh, most don't. I mean, there was one poem. Yeah. If your poems rhyme.
We didn't read that one, did we?
Yeah, there was one, but
There is no direct rhyme in neither of them, but there is in rhyme melody, and somehow I also, obviously, when you know the language, at least to read and listen to, you search for if this inner melody is also translated or not. And I spotted that. So, of course, it would not 100% be in the same place,
Yeah.
but obviously it was always there.
Yeah. That's my next So how did the translators render that? How did you deal with it?
I asked Janan very early on for a sound recording of her reading the poems because I wasn't at that stage familiar enough with the sound system of Turkish to know where repeated sounds were coming. So she made me a private sort of SoundCloud set list of all the poems, and I sort of had them on repeat whilst I was translating. And I guess by that means I feel like I became sensitive to the, as Karin says, the sometimes deeply patterned internal soundscapes of the poems. Like one of my favourite lines is the one that goes Olup ilik, Olup ilik, which actually I think, Janan, you got it exactly right on your first sweep. The lukewarm gutter, which is sort of a non-naturalistic line, but it's all about the sound.
It makes sense in that context.
Yeah, it's like it's mimicking the sound of blood flowing, isn't it?
That's like the final frontier of poetry translated. Thank you.
Karin, you live in Istanbul.
Yeah.
You're talking about cultural amnesia. I'm interested a little bit about what's been happening in recent years. People in power are adapting the physical evidence of the history of places like Istanbul to fit their own narrative, if you want. An example I've got in mind is one of the palaces on the walls of Istanbul, the Byzantine palace of Tekfursaray, which got adapted to resemble a Ottoman mansion almost. How do you react to this physical intervention in Istanbul, and how do other Istanbul react to it?
You know, I feel like an 80-year-old grandmother, so longing for the district. Obviously, I'm not that much old, but somehow it's not about the formation of memory and your age is a little bit problematic when you live in this country, and specifically in Istanbul. For the physical thing, there is a huge construction going on. Construction battles, I would call it, and the whole city is a huge construction site itself. And somehow, while we have a pro-Islamic conservative party, I would naively expect, at least, though my political views are completely different, but still at this point that they somehow show respect to the old districts and inner circles that make the city so specific. Here in London, for instance, of course there are huge skyscrapers and modern buildings, as we all see, but there is so many also these brick wall old buildings preserved, and somehow in the end they stay and exist in a harmony to each other. It's a wonderful collage. What we have in Istanbul is diminish everything that is somehow old means useless, and the same brutality goes on not only against the city but among the relations and again the politics. That's for the gentrification stuff. Other than that, of course, when you are of other cultures, somehow you cannot find your own traces. Traces that do not personally, for instance, for me as an Armenian, of course, would mean something. But other than that, I would be able to show you, you know, this country has Kurds and Armenians of at least 4,000 years, and here is the heritage. There is nothing to show, and when there is nothing to show, there is nothing to mourn, nothing to remember, nothing to cry. and you are, in the end, yourself a stone. That's my feeling.
Thank you.
When I like question is, I can be also funny. I have this potential. No, I really try also. Just a confession. When you come, from with heavy burdens, there is always the thing that you are somehow displaced in a showcase. So the pity, full of anger, anguish, turmoil, blah blah, and crying out all the pain. The pain is universal. I want to reach the hearts and what we somehow all feel, regardless of our geography. Of course, at one point I own something as a burden to my own land, ancestors, let's see where I come from. And this is an offering given to you just to make your life a little bit richer, if you are interested. But other than that, it's all about, we all are the same, regardless of who you are. And I really want to know you rather than repeat myself, or to be like the Greek mythological drama queen image, but like a real person, a woman with this identity to just giving myself with all my sincerity, because poetry is also for me a little bit, not a little bit, pure nakedness, like it was always there. Not that I'm so courageous in my life, but bravery comes with that I can write, and when I read it, I remember myself, okay, you are more than this one, now go on. And there is always laughter within it. The irony that we can laugh at it, first of all. I really laugh at myself because I'm really a cartoon character. Everything happens to me. And then again, there are moments somehow that there is such a point of grief that you cannot cry but laugh. It's a bitter laugh. I don't know if you have ever experienced it. Or there is such a joy, such a beauty that you can only cry but not laugh. It's so intense. So also give that kind of spirit. That's me.
Are you scared to be writing in Turkey?
Yes, of course, why not? It's the most unclever thing to do. But I do not have any other thing to do. If I could compose and make music, this would be perfect. I really would like to be a musician, because you cannot misinterpret a song. A song is a song. With words and language, there is always this danger too. So the tool itself is also not helping, is sometimes very cruel. But I really do not know what else to make. I'm destined to write. I cannot, not that as I said, I'm not that brave or that radical. I only do that I cannot stand without doing. I write.
Thank you.
Just for recording this time, because it will also be necessary. And also to show that other possibilities of life are there. Thank God.
Actually, I wanted to take up those last 2 points. So your points are very personal, and they're in many ways testimony to suffering. They bear witness to suffering, and there is a affectations, they have strong cathartic elements to it. But there is also the other side, and it feels a bit arbitrary, maybe obnubulated in your point, that the side that perhaps inflicts some of the suffering, though this is not its own equality. And I was wondering if your choice of keeping it like that is deliberate, and to what extent?
That the politics suffering is arbitrary, is my choice. It's rather actually my concern that, as I have said, I have been politically against my wish sometimes too much engaged, and I really write about it openly whenever there is these articles, columns and everything else. But when it comes to poetry, and when I wish that it's not specifically about a single person to name, single nation to emphasize, but rather give the feeling of this exile, deportation, or massacres, or assassinations. There, to turn them into metaphors, yes, is my choice, done for the sake of poetry. If there is the need to concentrate on a specific thing, okay, I do it too, but evil is so universal, and for me, I want to rather share it,
But it's
to be
not-
healed.
There are often intelligent people standing behind it. And that
Sorry?
there are often intelligent people standing behind it, in fact, in nearly all cases.
I don't understand.
There are often intelligent people standing behind evil, in fact, in nearly all cases, and they're kept in the shadow.
They will need not to read my poetry, the intelligent evil people. It's for you, for us, that we need each other. With the perpetrators, I will have nothing to do. I will not, you know, there was a time after the assassination of Hrant Dink, for instance, in 2007, there was a big crisis for me during my writing that I was so full of anger. Not anger, anger is okay, something I can go with. I first in my life felt hate, and with hate I cannot make anything. I was frustrated of my own self, and it was as if blood was shed upon me, and there I had to start to confess this hate and how to go on with the language of peace that I was taught by him, for instance, in the political context, and then creating something meaningful again in literature, which seemed nonsense at that time. Trying to find a connection, love, remembering myself, okay, you can do this. And while capturing it afterwards, because these are actually though little in shape, all the accumulation of 20 years almost, I would say. I started poetry right in the end after trying all other genres, because I had not that courage to somehow saying that I can write poetry, I want to write a poem. So after going through this battle, this is actually all the drips somehow that flow, and like tea, they are dense, they are combined just to enable having place for all those who were actually not there. And for this, sometimes metaphors are more useful than specific associations. And I really fear that somehow when, okay, you cannot like free choice, and I would respect, for instance, this poem does not suit me, doesn't say anything to me. That's good. But when somebody comes up and says, you know, that's cheap, that's full of slogan, there I would crash. So there is also this respect for literature and for what poetry stands for. It's more than my political pains or my personal pains shred. For that I have other tools to use. That was my concern.